Hello, this is Mr. White. I'm reading the 7th grade science textbook. We are in Chapter 4, Lesson 4, The Cell and Its Environment. My Planet Diary. Something good in the air. You're in your bedroom studying, and you smell something good. Someone is cooking lunch. How did the smell travel from the kitchen to your nose? During cooking, molecules from soup and many other foods diffuse, or spread further and further apart. The molecules are also carried by air currents. Your nose sniffs in the molecules and sends a message to your brain. Even if only one molecule in 10 million carries the odor, your nose will send a smell message. Amazingly, your brain can identify about 10,000 different smells. How do materials move into and out of cells? Cells have structures that protect their contents from the world outside the cell. To live and function, however, cells must let certain materials enter and leave. Oxygen and water and particles of food must be able to move into a cell, while carbon dioxide and other waste materials must move out. Much as a gatekeeper controls the flow of traffic into and out of a parking lot, the cell membrane controls how materials move into or out of a cell. Importance of the cell membrane. Every cell is surrounded by a cell membrane. In Figure 1, you can see that the cell membrane consists of a double layer of lipid molecules lined up side by side. Remember that lipids are a group of organic compounds found in living things. Here and there, in the double layer of lipid molecules, you can see proteins, some with chains of carbohydrates attached. Other carbohydrate chains sit on the surface of the membrane. All these molecules play an important role in helping materials move through the cell membrane. Some materials move freely across the cell membrane. Others move less freely or not at all. The cell membrane is selectively permeable, which means that some substances can cross the membrane while others cannot. Substances that can move into and out of a cell do so by means of one or two processes: passive transport or active transport. Diffusion and osmosis, forms of passive transport. If you have ever ridden a bicycle down a hill, you know that it takes hardly any of your energy to go fast. But you do have to use energy to pedal back up the hill. Moving materials across the cell membrane sometimes requires the cell to use its own energy. At other times, the cell uses no energy. The movement of dissolved materials across the cell membrane without using the cell's energy is called passive transport. Diffusion. Molecules are always moving. As they move, they bump into one another. The more molecules there are in a space, the more they are said to be concentrated in that space. So they collide more often. Collisions cause molecules to push away from one another. Over time, as molecules continue colliding and moving apart, they become less concentrated. Eventually, they spread evenly throughout the space. Diffusion is the process by which molecules move from an area of high concentration to an area of lower concentration. Consider a unicellular organism that lives in pond water. It gets oxygen from that water. Many more molecules of oxygen are dissolved in the water outside the cell than inside the cell. In other words, the concentration of oxygen is higher outside the cell. What happens? Oxygen moves easily into the cell. The diffusion of oxygen into the cell does not require the cell to use any of its energy. Diffusion is one form of passive transport. Osmosis. Like oxygen, water passes easily into and out of a cell across the cell membrane. Osmosis is the diffusion of water molecules across the selectively permeable membrane. Because cells cannot function properly without adequate water, many cellular processes depend on osmosis. Osmosis is a form of passive transport. Osmosis can have important effects on cells and entire organisms. The plant cells in the top photo of Figure 3 have a healthy flow of water both into and out of each cell. Under certain conditions, osmosis can cause water to move out of the cells more quickly than it moves in. When that happens, the cytoplasm shrinks and the cell membrane pulls away from the cell wall, as shown in the bottom photo. If conditions do not change, the cells can die. Facilitated diffusion. Oxygen and carbon dioxide diffuse freely across the cell membrane. Other molecules, such as sugars, do not. Sugars cannot cross easily through the membrane's lipid molecules. In a process called facilitated diffusion, proteins in the cell membrane form channels through which the sugars can pass. The word facilitate means to make easier. As shown in Figure 4, these proteins provide a pathway for the sugars to diffuse. The proteins function much the same way downspouts guide water that flows from the roof of a house to the ground. Facilitated diffusion uses no cell energy. It is another form of passive transport. Active transport. Molecules in cells must often move in the opposite direction from the way they would naturally move due to diffusion. That is, the molecules move from a place of lower concentration to a place of higher concentration. Cells have to supply the energy to do this work, just as you would supply the energy to pedal a bike uphill. Active transport is the movement of materials across a cell membrane using cellular energy. As in facilitated diffusion, proteins within the cell's membrane play a key role in active transport. Using the cell's energy, transport proteins pick up specific molecules and carry them across the membrane. Substances that are carried into and out of cells by this process include calcium, potassium, and sodium. Moving large particles. Some materials, such as food particles, are too large to cross the cell membrane. In a process called endocytosis, the cell membrane changes the shape and engulfs the particle. You can see this process happening in Figure 5. Once the food particle is engulfed, the cell membrane fuses, pinching off a vacuole with the cell. The reverse process, called exocytosis, allows large particles to leave a cell. During exocytosis, a vacuole first fuses with the cell membrane. Then the cell membrane forms an opening to the outside and spills out the contents of the vacuole. Both endocytosis and exocytosis require energy from the cell.